This meeting is now being recorded.
Okay, in today's webinar, we'll hear from Denver Center Theater Company's Off Center and Third Rail projects about engaging new and younger audiences through artistic experimentation, including immersive theater. Dance USA is a communications partner with the Wallace Foundation on Wallace's Building Audiences for Sustainability initiative. We're sharing news about the initiative and the learnings on building audiences for the arts with the field. Now for a little bit about today's speakers. Charlie Miller is an Associate Artistic Director at the Denver Center for the Performing Arts, where he oversees new and innovative theatrical programming. He co-founded Off Center in 2010 and has led its growth from a small theatrical testing center to one of the DCPA's signature lines of programming. Off Center's recent large-scale immersive and experiential projects, including Sweet and Lucky and The Wild Party, have garnered local and national praise and have attracted a significantly younger audience to the DCPA. Emily Kent is the Director of Marketing for the Theater Company and Off Center lines of programming at the Denver Center for the Performing Arts. She oversees marketing strategies and initiatives for a wide spectrum of productions, including new plays, musicals, classics, theater for young audiences, and experiential and immersive works. And Zach Morris is Co-Artistic Director of Third Rail Project, creators of the hit Then She Fell, now in its 8th sold-out year. Third Rail Projects is recipient of 3 New York Dance and Performance BESSY Awards, a Chita Rivera Choreography Award for Best Choreography in an Off-Broadway Show for Ghost Light at Lincoln Center Theater, and is nationally and internationally recognized as one of the foremost creators of immersive, experiential, and site-specific performance working today. Thank you to the 3 of you for being here today. We appreciate it. Now we'll hear from Zach about Third Rail Project. Over to you, Zach.
Great. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As Johanna said, I am one of 3 co-artistic directors of Third Rail Projects, along with Tom Pearson and Janine Willette. We are a multidisciplinary performance company based here in New York City. We are about to enter our 20th year as a company, and so we have had the pleasure of collaborating for all of those years, and very often with many of our artists who we've been making work with for either all 20 years or sometimes decades. And so as Johanna said, we're most well known as creators of site-specific immersive and experiential performance. And we found our way to creating this type of work through sort of a long and winding pathway, which I'll sort of give you a quick overview of. We started in 2000 as a bunch of very young creators. Third Rail was originally founded by Tom, Janine, and a gentleman named Brian Weaver, who were the co-founders of what was then Third Rail Dance. And they were creating work in a more traditional theater proscenium format. I was creating my own dance theater work alongside them. And eventually, Brian moved away to have a fabulous life in Italy, which he's still doing. And it was at that point when Tom, Janine, and I began collaborating. And one of the things that was really delightful with our myriad points of inquiry was discovering that the pieces that we created were really, the whole was more than the sum of their parts. And along with not only the content we were generating, we started to ask some very interesting formal questions, including how might we move art out of the art house, out of the theater, and so became very interested in public and site-specific work. We got commissioned and became known for creating work in unusual places at the the National Museum of the American Indian, which is the slide on the left here, as well as the South Street Seaport. And through these processes, we've sort of developed a unique toolbox, which was really about the idea of creating offerings for the denizens of these spaces. Very often we were creating works where people were living their day-to-day lives, and as opposed to just showing up and like throwing art at people, we became very interested in really listening to what the space was, not only in terms of the architecture, but also the culture, who were the denizens of this space, what is the history, what is the cultural topography. And that sense of listening and being able to create work that fills a vessel has sort of been one of our key components that we've been refining. And then we continue to sort of question the ways in which we could redefine our relationship with audiences. We spend a lot of time thinking about ritual and the ways in which audience members can engage with the performing arts. One example of this is Vanishing Point, which we won a Bessie for in 2008. And the point of inquiry there was looking at the context of a funeral. This was in St. Mark's Church, produced by Dance Space Project in New York, and telling sort of a story, a fragmented story of a collective, semi-fictitious autobiography of our families. We then became very interested in the notion of creating visual artworks, which is something that we had been doing sort of in parallel with this. And so we began creating installations, including some very large-scale installations. We made a museum that was full of almost entirely fictitious exhibits. And we became very interested in creating environmental installations where we and our audiences could move through and discover narratives that were hidden amongst these artifacts and bits of ephemera. Likewise, we began exploring different ways that we could engage with environments, finding increasingly stranger places to perform, and being able to grant audiences access to spaces that they might not otherwise have access. And through these sort of points of inquiry, we became really excited about how the reframing of performance was bringing us a different type of audience than we had seen in the past. Very often, the folks who were coming to see our works would not self-describe as theater goers or dance goers. And I think a lot of that came with the fact that we were recontextualizing where and how dance and theater was produced and the way in which audience members were able to engage with it. And we continued sort of these questions, which eventually led us to the creation of what is now called Then She Fell, which, as Johanna mentioned, is now in its 8th sold-out year. Then She Fell is based on the life and writings of Lewis Carroll, who is the creator of the Alice text. It is looking at his biography as well as the biography of Alice Little. And the piece itself is for only 15 audience members per performance. They, as well as our cast, navigate through 3 floors of a century-old institution, and audience members find themselves in small groups, either witnessing scenes through a window or through apertures, or very often find themselves as the scene partners in these various scenarios, many times in a one-on-one relationship with a performer where they're only centimeters away. And so, for example, one of the scenes is you may find yourself painting roses red, So Then She Fell was really the moment where we were, I think, noticed by a larger theater community, not only in New York, but also nationally. And it was at that point that we began really trying to understand what it was we had created with Then She Fell. And some of the key points that came out of that was we realized that we were responding to a cultural moment that felt very germane to us as artists, which was this notion that for the first time in our history as a species, we're navigating content in a very, very different way with the advent of the internet. We are interested in content that we can navigate and content that is responsive. And so we asked ourselves, how can theater and dance be responsive in this way? Also, we found ourselves asking questions and realizing that one of the most interesting things that we could do was to make the show about the audience. And by that, I mean creating scenarios in which the audience may find themselves the protagonist of the action. One of the ways that I like to describe our work is that it is sort of a Rorschach. We create hopefully a bunch of very interesting dots, but it is the audience's experience of connecting those dots that creates the image of the piece in their mind. And so there are things that are resonating with them. And the thing that's interesting about our work is very often audience members will come out of our show with vastly different experiences. And so much of that is a reflection of what they saw. From there, we, yes, performance is experience. I'm sorry, I should have said that. And so yes, we find ourselves creating performance as experience, finding ways that we can create moments where the audience is really having embodied experiences. From there, we've had the tremendous fortune to be able to collaborate with a number of really amazing organizations, including the DCPA, with Sweet and Lucky, Lincoln Center Theater 3 for Ghostlight, where we inhabited their entire theater, taking audiences to places that they wouldn't normally see in a theater. And so giving them access to dressing rooms and backstage and pop shops. We also created the Grand Paradise, which was a fictitious 1970s resort that promised to be the home of the original genuine Fountain of Youth. And audiences navigated through a series of scenes ruminating on notions of youth, loss, love, death. We also continue to be very interested in creating public works. So recently we created a work at Brookfield Place, also known as the World Financial Center, called Oasis, which was a series of new dances every day during lunch for 2 weeks that culminated into a evening-length performance. And so it was this series of offerings to the inhabitants of that space where they sort of had these bits of performance bubble up around them, and then they would be able to track the performance through multiple days. Lastly, one of our most exciting projects is collaborating with a Chicago-based company called Albany Park Theater Project, which is a youth theater program where the performers are high school students from Albany Park, which is historically a space where families who are relatively new to the States are coming. Many of the students are first generation, some are undocumented. We recently collaborated with APTP on the creation of Learning Curve, which put the audience in the shoes of someone who's navigating the Chicago public high school system. And these students were your counterparts, your teachers, and you found yourself literally walking alongside them as they told you this, as you experienced the story of what they live every day in school. That's very exciting. And that's about it for me. Over to you, Charlie and Emily.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. I am Emily Kent, and as was mentioned, I'm the Director of Marketing here, and then I'm with my colleague, Charlie.
Hi, this is my voice.
And the Denver Center is a really interesting organization to be engaging in this kind of immersive work. We are one of the largest nonprofit theater organizations in the country. And for about 40 years, over 40 years really, the DCPA has been doing main stage programming, which includes a Broadway touring line. We have a regional theater company that operates in 3 to 4 theaters doing things like musicals and Shakespeare and world premiere plays. We have a huge education department. And then a few years ago, with Charlie's leadership, we really started to dive into a new realm with more non-traditional programming with Off-Center.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of Off-Center and where it came from, and then we'll talk about some of the work and then get into our collaboration with Third Rail Project. So Off-Center was created in 2010 as a response to a lot of challenging trends that we were observing in Denver and across the performing arts field. I imagine many of these will sound familiar to all of you. Our audiences were aging. We were noticing changing customer behavior, Subscriptions were declining. There was more last-minute buying. We felt increased competition for the entertainment dollar as people were defining culture more broadly and seeking out different types of experiences. Suddenly, we were competing with Netflix and going out to dinner. And we noticed that there was a lack of interest among younger generations, or at least they were seeking something a little bit different. We had tried a bunch of different auxiliary programs and events to engage this younger audience, but they really only succeeded in reaching a smaller group that was already predisposed to theater. So after experimenting with different strategies to address these trends, we decided that we needed to try a more radical approach in hopes that it could make a difference. And so our hypothesis was that in order to reach new audiences, we had to create new programming that speaks to their interests. And from that notion, Off-Center was born. I was the token millennial on the artistic team at the time, and so was lucky enough to be asked to, along with my colleague Emily Tarquin, kind of lead this effort. And the artistic director, Kent Thompson, at the time really felt that it was important that this initiative was led by younger people for younger people. So we created what we called a theatrical test kitchen. And Off-Center's initial mission was twofold: to be a test kitchen for the organization where we could be experimenting with different ways of engaging this audience and different types of content and programming that might reach them and engage them. And also, again, the focus on experimentation and the focus on attracting this specific audience and group of artists. So in its 8-year history, Off-Center has been the beneficiary of 3 major grants from national funders, including the Wallace Foundation for the past 4 years. We were really fortunate to be accepted into the Wallace Foundation's Building Audience for Sustainability program. It has allowed Off-Center to expand and grow while keeping the Denver Center's investment relatively modest. So when we were accepted into this grant in 2015, we really focused in on the work that we had just started before that, which was immersive and experiential. And we had seen in New York and elsewhere that this work was successful in engaging a younger audience. And so for our Wallace grant, which asked organizations to identify a target audience and create programming to try and build that audience, we continued what we had been doing with Off-Center and focused on millennials, which are a huge population in Denver. The idea being that by producing more and larger off-site immersive and experiential work, we could, in fact, reach a younger audience. So with the support of Wallace over the past 4 years, we've now scaled that up pretty significantly and done 7 projects. Wallace emphasizes continuous learning and funds rigorous audience research. They support data analysis and internal reflection so that strategies can adapt and evolve. And so for the past 4 years, Off-Center's testing and experimentation has been exclusively focused on immersive and experiential work and its impact in building this audience for us. As I mentioned, this was all very data-driven, and now Emily's going to share some of our market research that we did at the very beginning of this process and what we've learned.
Great. So back in 2015, with the support of Wallace, we were really lucky to do market research here in Denver. And the way that we structured that was we went out of the gate with 6 qualitative focus groups. And even though our target audience was millennial, we also included a Gen X group of participants and a boomer group. And the reason for that was that then we could see, are there really differences between these generations and what they respond to or not? And we used the outcomes of those conversations in those focus groups to then create a quantitative study. About 60% of the survey list for the quantitative work was from our list, and about 40% was recruited. So we were talking to some people who had experience with the Denver Center, but also folks who did not. And we really dived into questions around how do you make decisions around which entertainment options to pursue? What was their awareness of Denver Center offerings? What were their barriers to attend some of our main stage work? And then we were also really lucky to get their feedback on some of these immersive concepts. So we kind of described some experiential, non-existent shows to them, and then we're able to hear really directly how those descriptions resonated with people. And so this survey work and this market research was not just able to help drive the marketing, but because of the timing, it also helped us on the artistic side. And I will say that while this was an amazing tool that we were able to fund through that grant, you can also do market research much more cheaply. A lot of the continued learnings that we have come from post-performance surveys where we just use SurveyMonkey. Really early in Off-Center's days, we did some more informal focus groups that we actually organized ourselves. So I do just want to call out that even if you don't have a huge budget or a huge grant, you can learn more about your audience. But back to what we learned, this research really helped us bust some myths and assumptions that we had. Hold on one sec. There's something going on with our screen.
Can you, it looks like we're out of the slideshow right now.
Yes, I see that. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Let me
Really stretch.
just reload it. Maybe someone inadvertently hit screen share. Okay. Just loading.
Great. Here we go.
Yep.
Okay, great. So we busted some myths. One of them that I think a lot of people have is we all assume that millennials are super last minute buyers. And at least what we learned about our millennials here in Denver is that that wasn't true. Over 60% of them planned to go to the theater or made other entertainment choices over a month in advance. That was super helpful for us as we planned our marketing timing. Millennials were also not as price sensitive as we thought. Across those different generational groups, everybody generally expected to pay about the same amount for that hypothetical experience that we described. We also had been hearing a lot about how Facebook was dead for millennials and that that wasn't a good way to get a hold of them anymore. Again, myth busted. It was, right after hearing from word of mouth, the top way that millennials were finding out about new activities. And I would say just generally, there were fewer differences than we expected. We really thought that the millennial groups would respond in pretty different ways. And we saw a lot of similarities between the millennial groups, the Gen X groups, and the boomer groups. Aside from the myths, this research also gave us some other really key takeaways as we started to double down on this immersive and experiential programming, especially around how we set expectations and talk about the work. We did hear a lot of questions and some fear around the word interactive, where people were imagining a more traditional experience and getting yanked up on stage in the spotlight. So we really kind of moved away from using that term. We also learned that the element of surprise was very, very appealing to these millennial audiences, and that in general, they were willing to do pretty much anything. They didn't really need to know a lot about what that artistic experience was, as long as they had enough of a logistical understanding about how to show up for that event. We got a lot of questions about parking, for example. And then we also learned about what kind of vibes that the different groups wanted. Unsurprisingly, almost everyone said they wanted something fun, casual, and entertaining. And millennials in particular were not looking for events that were exclusive, serious, or high-end. And while largely we did not necessarily adhere to these wishes, which Charlie will talk more about, it was really useful to bear in mind what kind of experiences people think they want.
As I mentioned, over the past 4 years with Wallace's support, we've now produced 7 projects that have been a very broad range of immersive and experiential offerings. I think what they've had in common is that we've tried to put the audience at the center of the story and give them an active role in the experience. So never were they just sitting in seats. These projects have ranged from an audience size of 208 per performance to 1 audience member per performance. They've taken place from public spaces all around downtown Denver to a 16,000 square foot warehouse that we built out every inch for Sweet and Lucky. They've been original, we've commissioned work, they've involved dance and improv, audio and with no actors, and we even did a 360-degree staging of a musical, The Wild Party. But to start this work back in 2015, we realized we needed an expert to do it. And I had seen Then She Fell and was a huge fan of Third Rail's work. And we decided that the first thing we would do with our Wallace grant is to commission Third Rail to create a project with us and for us in Denver. And so now Zach is going to tell you a little bit more about Sweet and Lucky, the project that we produced here in 2016. Take it away, Zach.
Thanks. I think one of the things that is important to know about Sweet and Lucky and my relationship with the Denver Center is I was born and raised in Denver. And so from the get-go, this piece for me was a bit of a homecoming. And so as Charlie and the creative team and I were talking about what type of work we would want to create for the DCPA and for Denver, I was really resonating with notions of home and family. And in particular, I had some questions coming off of the other works that Third Rail had recently done about not only sort of deepening our relationship to ritual or shared experiences, but being able to create opportunities where audiences would find themselves intuitively, organically, and gently folded into embodied experiences where they would be able to have sort of an emotional resonance, again, without being put on the spot, but where they could find themselves quite literally inside of the fabric of a story and be able to navigate and have it be responsive to them while being able to have a little bit of aesthetic distance as an audience. And so one of the things that happened was we started thinking about this idea of Sweet and Lucky as a sort of a speakeasy antique store where the audience entered Sweet and Lucky, and the audience was 72 audience members. And you would enter a antique store where nothing was for sale. And so for the pre-show experience, the audience found themselves rummaging through old bits of photographs and things that you might find in an antique store, but also perhaps in your grandma's attic. And as the show began, the performers found their way into the antique store, gathered audience members into smaller groups, did a short introductory scene, sort of framing the experience a little bit, and then handed every audience member an umbrella and brought them through a door into a graveyard where it was raining. And so immediately you found yourself under a black umbrella with a number of other attendees at a funeral. And as the rain petered out, there was sort of an inappropriate eulogy that was given to whomever was in the coffin. And it's actually sort of one of the interesting things about Sweet and Lucky is that We never say who is in the coffin. In fact, my dad, who I think is listening, hi Dad, after seeing it, he asked me, well, so who is in the coffin? And I was like, I don't know. Who do you think was in the coffin? And so after you find yourself at this funeral and you are invited to sort of sing one of those hymns that nobody knows the words to, and so the entire audience has a little hymn card and everyone's like, you find yourself broken off into smaller groups where you find yourself sort of shotgunning through the life and remembrances of a couple, from moments where they might have first met at a swimming hole to the beginnings of a new family, walking into a moment where we're putting the baby to sleep and we sing the baby a lullaby / drinking song, a moment where you realize that this relationship is in crisis, moments where you find yourself with other characters who are packing up the belongings of someone and ruminating on notions of memory, on loss. What it means for memory to be indelibly recorded on your psyche and how memory changes. There is a passage that happens in the room that's on the slide right now that talks about the idea that memory is like a Polaroid. The more times that you remember something, it's a Polaroid taken of a Polaroid taken of a Polaroid. Your memory of a thing is the last time you remembered it, and how might that change what is actually remembered. And again, some of this came from a very personal place. I had a few months before really beginning to create Sweet and Lucky, I had the opportunity to visit my grandma. And Grandma showed us we showed Grandma several slides and pictures of her life and her history, including places where she grew up, the house that she lived as my father was growing up with her. And there was a beautiful sort of moment late in our visit where Grandma saw one of the slides and began describing the room that it was as the room that she grew up in, and a room that she had been in as a wife and mother in her midlife, and also the room that she was currently in. And it became clear at that moment that my grandma was existing in sort of a memory palace in which every room was the same room. And that really became the like beating heart of Sweet and Lucky. And so I was interested in creating a way in which the audience could move through this remembrance of a life and a love, and loss of memory and forgiveness and forgetting. And so that took many different forms. Some scenes which were conversations with the audience, games that the audience played. It was multisensory in a number of ways. There were bits of ephemera or letters you would find, reel-to-reel recordings, smell, which is an amazing way to access memory, as well as drinks where you would sort of play a little game of tarot with a bartender who would fix you a cocktail. And so in all of these ways, we were interested in creating an embodied and visceral experience where you were moving through and participating in this history. And then finally, the way that the piece culminates is you find yourself back at the graveyard. You once again sing this hymn, and then over the hymn, the performers start singing this lullaby that you've learned, and you realize that it's actually an incredibly complicated round. And then the audience, or the performers sort of drift away, and you find yourself in this graveyard, sort of with perhaps not any answers to questions, but a number of new questions, which is really the point of inquiry that I think we're most excited about, is how do we create questions, and how can we ask those questions, and not necessarily feed the audience the answers, but allow them to have space to ruminate on how these images and relationships might be resonant in their own life. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the key tenets that that Third Rail thinks about, as well as some of the key learnings and pillars of ideas that the DCPA and specifically Off-Center have started thinking about. So I think as Third Rail has created these works over the years, things that feel key to every process is really going back to our earliest days of creating site-specific work. And those are creating every work as an invitation and as an offering to the audience, and to be able to create invitations to engage with performance. And for us, that kind of is a really soup to nuts endeavor, anywhere from the way in which we are marketing to the way in which the audience is engaging with the ticket buying website. How are we being responsive and thoughtful to be able to frame expectations for our audience, and to invite them into this shared experience. Also, the idea that our work is an offering to the audience, and that the audience is the most important person in our work. And so we design with the audience in mind, and that can take a number of different forms. And actually, that is sort of the second major tenet, which is this idea of re-contextualized performance. And this again really came from the site-specific work, where we realized very early on that coming in with preconceived notions of the form or the discipline that we should create a work for a new site was not going to work. We really needed to listen to what the vessel was, what the space was. And in many ways, that also is resonant for the cultural moment that we're in. How do we continue to listen to the cultural moment and create not only content, but context that enable us to talk about where we are in the world? What do we need as a society, as a culture? What are the things that we might be missing in this moment? As I mentioned, we're at a very strange point. Not since the printing press has the way in which we engage with content changed so much. We spend so much of our time both more connected and less connected to human beings than we ever have been. And so I think beautifully, perhaps the performing arts have a unique corner on a market where I think very often all of us, and I think especially millennials and young people, are yearning to have a human-to-human interaction, to be able to breathe the same air as a performer, and to be able to step away from the proscenium of their iPhones. And so, what are the different ways that we can radically reimagine performance? The slide that you're seeing is a piece called Behind the City, which was created for only 2 audience members at a time, and they found themselves navigating a neighborhood in downtown Manhattan, going up into apartments to see a scene, and then going downstairs and looking up from across the street into a window 5 floors up to see a dance happening. And this was a question for me about how do we talk about the way in which the city writes our memories not only on itself, but the city also imprints itself on our memory. And so we continue to be very excited about reimagining the way that performance and audience can engage, and being able to make new tools to create new ways for that to happen. And now I'll send this over to Charlie and Emily to talk about some of the learnings from DCPA.
Thanks, Zach. We're going to share quickly our 6 key lessons that we've learned over the past 4 years doing this work. We're going to move pretty quickly through these slides so that we allow some time for your questions at the end. And as a reminder, if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat as we go, and we'll try to hit as many of them as we can at the end. So our first big lesson was that different work requires working differently. This might be kind of obvious, but we saw the ways that this work really challenged us as an organization to be more nimble, to kind of break out of our traditional ways of building a show and supporting a show. It requires constant communication and enrolling of stakeholders. There are huge implications for working in a space that's not set up for performance, and it requires an additional investment in infrastructure and more time for permitting and dealing with the city. And in some cases, we've also had to deal with the unions, especially Actors Equity, to get them to adapt the way they think about contracting performers for this work, because it just operates in such a different universe.
Mm-hmm. Our other big lesson is that we've learned to really blur the lines between what we consider artistic and marketing. And for us, we really believe that that marketing moment is the first part of the artistic moment. That's the first interaction that a patron is going to have with your show. And so we've built out some special websites that truly immerse the online experience in that look and feel of the show in the same way that the physical experience will. So here's an example from our show of The Wild Party. Marketing has been involved in naming some of our shows, which has been really fun too. And especially when it comes to running a show, we're really used to a front of house role and a back of house role. And as soon as you are bringing patrons in a mobile way through an experience, in a lot of ways, your crew has to learn how to do customer service, and your front of house team has to learn how to welcome the patrons in a way that is part of that artistic experience. So the more you can blur those lines and really think of it, the whole experience from the first ad they see or the first website touch through when they're leaving the venue and beyond, that has been really successful for us. We've also learned that expectation setting is really, really crucial when you're doing something that is unlike what a patron has experienced before. We develop really robust FAQs. Again, these are largely based on logistics, and that's from our market research, where we heard that people want to know, where do I park? What should I wear? Can I bring a bag? Is this a play? And then we also include some that are more psychological. For example, come as yourself. You don't need to act. We learned also after Sweet and Lucky, which you guys have heard a lot about today, that when we first did that show, it was the first major immersive show in Denver, and it set an incredibly high bar for everyone who experienced it. People loved it. And that type of experience, being fully built out, incredibly intimate, amazing scenic design that people were moving through, really became synonymous with immersive work here in Denver. And since then, the shows we did right afterwards, we learned that we needed to be more explicit about how these shows were not like Sweet and Lucky. So what you're seeing here is a word cloud of comments for our show that we did after Sweet and Lucky. And you see that Sweet and Lucky was one of the most common words that people were referencing, where they said, I really thought this was going to be more like Sweet and Lucky. And so we've learned how to talk about these different experiences very differently. Again, this is some data from the show that we did right after Sweet and Lucky, where we do a quick survey after every single show saying, would you recommend this production? And we weren't seeing quite as high responses as we wanted. And so what we did around week 6 and 7 there is we actually changed the marketing language around it. We changed the expectations for how people would experience this show without changing anything artistically. By having a clearer understanding of what our patrons were getting into, they were better prepared for that, and you can see that their responses went up because their expectations were more in line with what that artistic experience was. Lesson number 4, research is great, but audiences don't always know what they want. And so that kind of harkens back to when I was talking about the vibes that people said they wanted. Sweet and Lucky was everything they said they did not want. It was emotionally moving and interactive and reflective and serious. Meanwhile, a show we did right after that, Travelers of the Lost Dimension, was lighthearted and fun and casual and relaxed and entertaining. And the vibes that you see here under those 2 columns, that's what our patrons told us these experiences were. But yet people really, really loved and responded to Sweet and Lucky. And we didn't see quite the same audience response for Travelers. So again, just a little nod to say that audiences don't always know what they want, and that's where that artistic impulse really comes in to create something special for them.
And so we do use that data to inform our artistic decision making, but we're not relying on it to tell us what we should do next. And so there is this kind of constant tension and dialogue that's really productive and exciting to us, where we're looking at the data, seeing what it's telling us, and also thinking about new things that people maybe haven't even thought of that they might want.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is just a look at one of our post-show surveys. So what we're digging into here is, why did you want to come to this? What parts of this were interesting to you? Over and over again, we see that being out of the ordinary is a major driver for folks to want to do something like this that's out of the ordinary, right? It's different from the traditional theater or dance experiences that they've had before. And then lesson 5, this has worked for us. We have been able to reach a new audience with this new approach. And that's both a new approach to the artistic side and the marketing side. Our immersive audiences are younger than our main stage programming audiences. We are seeing more new audiences come in for the immersive work. We are quickly learning that they are hungry for this type of experience, with many of them returning year after year to these different immersive experiences that we've done. And of those ticket buyers who were new to the Denver Center for an immersive production, about 20% have come back to make a purchase to a different Denver Center experience, which is really interesting to us. So there is some crossover with our more main stage programming, and most of that is actually with our Broadway touring line. About 60% have overlapped with Broadway touring. And so for us, this demonstrates that we're not just creating new immersive fans, but we are also providing a new entry point into our organization and some of our more traditional theatrical programming.
And our final lesson, which is a purely artistic one, is that a compelling story is the most important. Consistently through these 7 projects, the ones that people have responded to the best in the surveys have been the ones that had a clear narrative through line, and the ones that people have not enjoyed as much are the ones where that wasn't as present. And so as we do this work, we really focus on storytelling as being at the center. And finally, you can kind of read this on your own as well, but these are some of the key benefits that we've seen Off-Center has had on the Denver Center as a whole over the years. It has brought in a newer audience and a younger audience. It has created all these new opportunities for audience engagement and loyalty. It's helped us diversify our offerings and expand our reach. It's brought in a number of new sources of significant funding to the organization and has created a lot of opportunities for local artists. And with that, we have some time for questions. So Emily, why don't you start off the bat and just answer the 2 marketing questions that came in first?
Sure.
So there was a question about what is the marketing investment as a % of sales in the different media mix. For these immersive productions, we've usually spent about 15 to 30% as a % of our revenue goals. And that mix and that spend has really depended on the project. So, for example, when we did a one-on-one experience this spring, literally one actor, one audience member, we didn't spend the same % that we would on something like Sweet and Lucky. I will say that the mix leans very heavily digital. We have done some of these shows that have had a purely digital marketing spend. But for our bigger shows, I also really love doing outdoor. If you can get in those hot neighborhoods where your audience tends to live or hang out, that's been helpful for us. And we've even done some cool like direct mail. For the Wild Party, we sent Queenie's headshot that just said like, "Can't wait to see you, XOXO." So it wasn't a traditional direct mail piece, but it was something, again, more evocative of that experience and teasing that intimate nature and showing how different it was even from a marketing perspective. And then as far as the size of the audience surveyed, we have sent the surveys to everyone who's come to these. I am not sure off the top of my head what kind of % response we've gotten, but it's been pretty good. People are really eager to give us their feedback about these non-traditional experiences. Again, if the show itself is incredibly small, you might have 100 responses, but that could be a pretty good response rate, or you could have 300, 400, 500. As another point, we've also done some control surveying. So we've picked some of our main stage theater programs and sent very similar surveys so that we can see how do those vibes compare for an immersive show to a main stage show. What about the other factors? How much people enjoyed them? What were the things that drove them to attend? And so it's been really a good learning for us to do some more extensive audience surveying for all of our different productions.
Zach, do you want to take the next question about identifying a site and dealing with the owners and stuff? And I can then add my producer perspective after you go.
Sure. We very early on when we were a young company, yes, we did make cold calls to ask if we could perform in these spaces. As we became a little bit better known, we were commissioned often to create specific works for sites. And as we have moved into self-producing or presenting with a partner, we have been able to reach out to landlords of various spaces. And, very often I'm finding that landlords and spaces are eager to have these types of animation. They're interested in bringing in cultural activities. They're interested in bringing in a new group of folks into their spaces. And so they've often been really great partners. Charlie, do you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, we've found the same thing, especially now that we have a track record. It's gotten easier and easier, even though the real estate market has gotten hotter and hotter in Denver. And then there's the whole other side of like the permitting and the fire life safety and the infrastructure, which is a whole nother webinar on itself and has been an area of expertise we did not expect to need, but we have now learned a lot, and it's a huge and complicated process. But it's part of, I think, what makes this work so exciting to people is not being in a traditional space and being surprised by what you're going to discover inside. So it feels like it's worth the extra work and the headaches and the cost to pull this off. Jennifer asked about costs versus revenue. And what we can say is that on average across our 7 projects, the 42% of costs have been covered by earned revenue. And the range across projects has been from 66% on the high end to 15% on the low end, which was our one-on-one project. Do you want to answer the subscription?
Yeah. So none of these shows have been on a subscription for us. We have subscriptions for our Broadway line, our main stage regional theater line, but we have not tried to package the immersive shows into that in any way. So I don't know that they have had an impact on subscriptions. And I will say, even separately from this, in our theater company work, we have seen a great increase in our millennial participation as there as well. We don't necessarily think that is causal, like it's not necessarily people who came to this and then directly went over there, but we have in general grown our capacity to attract millennials, both with this non-traditional work and with some of our more traditional programming.
Yeah, I'll also just hop in here about the finances. Third Rail has produced a number of these shows, and I feel as if it is true that the initial cost to create these works is often high, and so they very often benefit from a longer run, and it's with those runs that are able to be multi-week or multi-month that we've been able to see the earned income be able to significantly offset some of the costs associated with the starting of a project.
Yeah, and that seems to be the model in this immersive and experiential space, that the only way, I mean, the economies of scale and what people like is the intimacy, and so scaling it up just means adding more people. So the only way you can offset the cost is to run it for a long time if you're lucky enough. What's great too is that builds word of mouth, and so there is a model that works, and Third Rail obviously has proven it in their 8-year run, and we've been able to extend a number of our shows for a month or two, but we have not, for various reasons, been in the territory of shows that are running for more than 12 weeks.
If I can, I'd love to just quickly answer the available research materials about traditional theaters trying to create these types of partnerships in places where they want to create immersive works but are very focused on traditional main stage shows. Third Rail has had a couple partnerships where we've been working with a company like the DCPA that has a more traditional show, and a unique model that we've found is actually creating a companion piece for a main stage show. And so there might be a smaller immersive or experiential work that perhaps shares some of the themes or images around what is happening on the main stage. And that's a really sort of beautiful model in that it invites some of these audiences who might not otherwise find themselves coming to a theater or an institution because they're they're experience seekers. Perhaps they wouldn't identify themselves as culture seekers, but it becomes sort of a beautiful gateway drug where these audiences are coming to the experiential part of it, and then buying a ticket for the main stage. So I think, though that's not qualitative or quantitative research, that's a little bit of anecdotal information that I can offer on that point.
Yeah, and the Wallace Foundation is very research focused, as I mentioned before, and they've done case studies on a number of their grantees. And if you go to their website, you can find them. There is a profile about us from a couple of years ago that talks about Sweet and Lucky. So that's something, if you're looking to share, that a third party has done about this work. And there's some other great tools and sources of data there that you might find interesting. So we're at about 1 o'clock. Johanna, should we keep going? Do we want to wrap this up?
Well, there are just 2 more questions. If you think you can turn to those 2, then we could wrap it up right after that. So quickly,
Absolutely.
The question about funding and the admission question.
Yeah. So the admission question, the one-on-one shows we actually had 3 different experiences you could buy. One was a blind date, one was a whiskey tasting, and one was a card reading, which was just you and an actor for an hour plus. It was very complicated logistically because we didn't have front of house. So they bought a ticket online. You couldn't buy at the door because there was no door. These took place in public spaces around the city. And once you bought a ticket, you were texted information by the stage manager pretending to be the character, and you coordinated by text where to meet up to start the experience. So it was awesome and a huge headache and very complicating because we were blurring the lines between box office, front of house, which didn't exist, and stage management and the actors. So very cool, but very difficult. And then in terms of our future plans, we have decided that post-Wallace, we're really going to focus in on the larger projects that can serve a larger audience over time. It doesn't mean the audience size is bigger. It means that we're trying to create projects that can run longer and accommodate more people. We also have an immersive Christmas experience that we're building currently that will have timed entry. And so that will have the potential to reach a much larger audience. And in both of these future projects, the big one will be announced in about a month. The throughput or the number of audiences per week is high enough that the revenue expense equation is different. And the possibility for it to run longer and have revenue offset more of the cost is a real thing. So we've figured out how to do this in a way that kind of replaces the Wallace funding and doesn't require more investment from the DCPA, at least in the short term. And we're hoping that if we can have a kind of bigger blockbuster project that can help fund more experimentation and future projects, that becomes its own sustainable ecosystem that will certainly require more grant support and individual contributions, but that doesn't drastically alter the budget of the organization, at least in the short term. So it's a work in progress. We'll let you know how it goes, but we think that there's a path forward to do this work sustainably going forward.
And I'll just add from Third Rail's point of view, we are, I think 97% of our income is earned revenue. And so we have very much found that these types of experiences and being able to offer the performing arts in these recontextualized formats is something that audiences are willing to pay for. And so we've been able to create models that are able to sustain our artist-run company for these many years creating this type of work.
Okay, thank you, Zach, Charlie, and Emily. I really appreciate you speaking with everyone today, and thank you to everyone out there in the audience. Thank you for participating, and that will be it. And we hope you enjoyed it, and come to another one in the future.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.